Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. We get word today, just as we were starting the podcast, that there are a resumption of the high-level trade talks between Ottawa and Washington about trying to hammer out some sort of a trade deal between Canada and the United States. Now, I don't exactly know what that means. We know that last week or so when Prime Minister Carney was down in Washington and met with Donald Trump, they apparently, according to the press releases, gave marching orders to both their teams, the negotiating teams, to stay there until they could find some common ground in a deal. Well, they haven't done it yet. And some of the news we're hearing today kind of casts a big cloud over top of everything. First of all, just a couple of days, the very next day, as a matter of fact, the very next day after that meeting, Lutnick, who's his Commerce Secretary and the guy suing on the negotiations for Trump, basically said that Canada's just going to have to get used to the fact that as far as automobiles are concerned, they're always going to be second. All the cars are going to be made in the States, or so he says, and maybe we can, supply parts or something like that from time to time. Well, that's hardly going to quell anybody's concerns about, the way the U.S. wants to deal with Canada when it comes to trade relations. So that's out there. Then comes news just a couple of days later that Stellantis, used to be Chrysler, you may remember, is now reneging on their commitment, and that's a big word there, commitment, to retool the Brampton plant and start designing and building Jeeps for the future, just a couple of years. And this was going to be a real shot in the arm to Brampton. And now they said, no, we're not going to do it. They're moving their operation down to the States. Yeah, you've heard that before, haven't you? Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown is outraged. Doug Ford is outraged. We'll get back to him in just a minute. And so is Prime Minister Mark Carney. But the reality here is, what are we going to do about this? And therein lies the problem. Chrysler, or Stellantis, by the way, was one of the big three automakers that the Canadian and U.S. governments bailed out back in 2009 when they were essentially bankrupt. They were closing operations, that they're going to shut up shop. And the auto industry in North America, not just in Canada, was in dire circumstances then. And I can tell you from our standpoint here, the Canadian government, between the federal government, Prime Minister Harper at the time, and Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty, they kicked in a lot of cash. I mean, a lot of cash to get these guys back on their feet and to keep the plants open. And by the way, to help these guys maintain their profit margins and everything else. It wasn't just the workers. Thank God the workers were looked after, but the executives, because they kept the companies basically afloat. So there's another argument to be made that, Stellantis owes us, but they don't seem to care about that anymore. But maybe that's just the nature of big business these days, but it's kind of sad. But, and by the way, we should mention that part of the money that was laid out for these big three, including Stellantis, were loans. But a couple of years later, of course, both the federal and provincial governments just said, don't bother paying them back. We forgive the loans. We just want to keep the industry going. But what that does, it underscores that the Canadian government, the Ontario government, and the Canadian government, working in partnership, have gone the extra mile for the auto industry. And now they're getting slapped in the face by what's happening in the States, but also what's happening up here. And, the words from Stellantis that, no, we're still committed to Canada. We're going to plant the Pacifica, the van. We're going to still make those down in Windsor, yada, yada, yada. Empty words. I mean, when you close a plant and move it down to the States, it's a real kick in the teeth to the Canadian economy, especially to the Ontario economy. So I don't know what's going to come of it. The fact that seems to be the mindset that the Americans have during these negotiations doesn't really shine a whole lot of optimism on these talks, does it, as to where they're going, because that just seems to be the mindset. But, as Prime Minister Carney has told us, there's going to be some setbacks. This is a marathon. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And most business leaders, even those that are frustrated, by the way, which is most of them these days, are of the understanding that you're not going to snap your fingers and make this thing go away, the tariffs and all the other issues that are coming out of Washington these days. Sadly, Pierre Poilievre doesn't seem to get that. Remember the note that he sent a couple of weeks ago? First of all, what would you do? And he says, well, I demand that the tariffs all be dropped. I mean, how realistic is that, really? And he says, cut it out. I'm going to tell Donald Trump, cut it out. Well, that would have finished everything. That would have just changed everything, wouldn't it? This is such a juvenile approach to this. So I'm frustrated. The auto industry is frustrated. The agricultural industry, we're all frustrated. But we've got the best possible team working on this right now. And sometime, we're going to find some solution. But I still adhere to what we talked about in previous podcasts, and the Prime Minister has reminded us that we're not going to get a fast deal. We want a good deal. And those things are not the same. I mean, there's going to have to be some give and take here. And right now, the Americans don't seem to want to give anything, and that's going to be somewhat of a problem. So how do we deal with that on the side of the border? Well, because it's not a singular issue. We have to include the bigger picture here when we're talking about the Canadian economy and the impact that not just the tariffs are having, but the impact that it's having on international trade as well. And that brings China into the picture, doesn't it? China, of course, made an announcement a few days ago, and we talked about this in one of our previous podcasts, where the ambassador to Canada essentially said, look, drop those 100% tariffs on our Chinese EVs. Let them come into the country tariff-free, and we'll back off on the canola and all the agricultural stuff that we've been whacking you guys with for the last little while. Well, that caught the attention of Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, and certainly the Winnipeg, Manitoba jumped right in too. Webb Canoe, the premier of Manitoba, jumped in and said, look, yeah, you know what, government? Drop those tariffs. Drop those tariffs, and that way there'll at least be some relief. Well, it's not that simple. Because as we've talked about before, for every action, there's a reaction. Dropping the tariffs, first of all, is going to open the Canadian market up to Chinese EVs. And a lot of people in the industry are very concerned about that. There are security issues, by the way. And, let's not shortchange those. That's one element of it. The other is that, as we've talked about it before, when we've dealt with economists who are trying to evaluate the Chinese industry, first of all, the auto industry in China is very heavily subsidized by the government. Okay, so they want that product out there, even if they have to take it at a loss. They sell cheaply in other countries, and that would happen in Canada, too, if we drop those tariffs, which would seriously cripple the automakers in this country. And, for the short-term gain that might happen, and I say might happen, do we ruin the other auto industry aspects of it, especially here in Ontario? That's what the Prime Minister's dealing with right now. He's got to look at the big picture. Doug Ford spoke about this just a couple of days ago. He was addressing the Empire Club in Toronto. And Ford praised Carney, by the way. He's been a strong ally, and he's one of these, we got to have the team approach and everything. But he was adamant, and apparently is meeting with the Prime Minister in just a couple of hours from the time we're doing this podcast, and telling him, don't drop the tariffs on Chinese EVs. Yeah, there could be a benefit as far as the Western farmers are concerned and their economy, but it would kill the auto industry here in Ontario. And so people in the auto industry here are saying the exact same thing. For whatever reason, Donald Trump started this whole thing with tariffs in China and on Chinese EVs. I think it was more political than anything else. There is an economic aspect to this, too, and Canada could get caught in the after effects of that. And we don't want to put ourselves in an even more precarious position than we already are, do we? So therein lies the problem. And, the tactic that they've been taking is what many other countries have been taking, and it's what we used against Donald Trump the first time around when he started throwing tariffs around. And that was simply to put political pressure on. And that's working. We've heard stories from U.S. politicians, governors, state legislatures, et cetera, saying, we're not bringing the U.S. economy down. Trump's doing that all by himself. He doesn't need our help to do that. But there are certain aspects of it, like, for instance, the whiskey industry, tourism is a big part of this too, that have suffered immeasurably because Canadians have basically turned their back and said, we're not buying your products anymore. We're not going down there anymore. We're not going to vacation there. We're not going to spend our money there. And that's hurt those economies. And I know that they have petitioned Trump, and you've seen some of the ads, I'm sure, on this side of the border, suggesting that, please come to Canada. We still like you. Well, as we've said, we like you too. We still like you too, Americans. But you've got a crazy man in the White House right now that's dragging your economy down and our economy down. Get rid of him. Do something about that. And then, we can go back to necessarily the way we were, but at least we can go back to a relationship that's going to be mutually beneficial. We're not there yet. And, we've tried, and I think the Prime Minister has tried time and time again to indicate that's the message that we want to get across to the American people. Doug Ford is on side with it. One of the things he talked about at his meeting with the Empire Club was the Ontario government is going to spend tens of millions of dollars right now on an ad campaign on U.S. television, U.S. media, CNBC, Bloomberg, a number of networks like this, basically saying that tariffs are bad. And who's their spokesperson? Who's the person who's going to take the lead on this? Ronald Reagan. Yeah, that Ronald Reagan. He spoke out adamantly against tariffs back when he was president of the United States. And that's still on video. And we're going to use clips of that. The Ontario people are going to use clips of that, basically to say that tariffs kill economies, kill the U.S. economy. And that's the message he wants to drive home. And I guess what Ford is suggesting, which is probably not a bad idea, is if you're not going to listen to us, listen to what you Republicans think is maybe one of the greatest presidents of all time. I mean, that's debatable, but that seems to be their mindset. Ronald Reagan was against tariffs and said they're detrimental. Can't you listen to at least what he's saying? I hope it works. For all of our sakes, I hope it works. I am skeptical, and as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, because this all comes down to Donald Trump. It's one thing to say we want to pressure senators and Congress people, but they really don't have a say in this. According to the Constitution of the states, as we mentioned before, the president isn't supposed to be making these trade deals. That's up to Congress to do. They've simply backed off and said, let Trump do whatever Trump wants. We don't want to get him angry at us. So they've abdicated their responsibility. So it's Trump that you have to convince. And the problem, as I see it, Donald Trump doesn't give a damn. That's really what it comes down to. I know that some Republicans that are not MAGA, and there are still a few of them, I guess, are very concerned about the midterm elections coming up next year, and afraid that a lot of Republicans are going to lose their seats because the economy's tanking, people are losing jobs. I don't think Trump cares. I really don't think he cares about that anymore. He did maybe in the first term because he had this idea and ambition that he wanted to stay on, but I don't know if he doesn't want to run again. I think he probably does. He wants to be king for life. That's really what he wants. And I don't think he gives a damn one way or another. And I can see his point, as twisted as it might be. Even if the Republicans lose control of the House of Representatives or even the Senate or both, why should Trump care? He's basically doing an end round around both of those right now. He's enacting legislation and laws without even passing the consent of the Congress or the Senate. So what would change if they were losing the power in either one? It just isn't going to happen. Trump is ruling as an autocrat, and nobody's stopping him. As the Congress is turning a blind eye to this, the Senate is turning a blind eye to us. Trump knows that he has the full and unwavering support of all the MAGA members, the majority on the Supreme Court who are MAGA members. They'll rubber stamp anything he wants. That's why he put them in there. So there are no checks and balances, and he can stop anytime and do anything he wants vis-a-vis trade, declare war, whatever the case may be. That's pretty scary, isn't it? And there's one other card that he has the ability to play, and he's talked about it and threatened about doing this in the past, and that is, of course, invoking the Insurrection Act, which basically means there's a revolt going on in this country. The government is at stake. The economy is at stake. It's a national crisis, and he can basically freeze everything. It's sort of like martial law, but it's the president that's calling the shots. And part of that Insurrection Act gives him the ability to postpone or cancel elections. Now, think about that. He could cancel the midterm elections. He could cancel the next presidential elections. He has that ability. It's a weapon that they don't want the president to use, but this guy has no holds barred, and he could well invoke that and simply cancel the election altogether, which, by the way, would fall right in line with some of the autocratic things that he's talked about doing and already has done in that country. I know it's a scary proposition, and I know that there's still a lot of Americans that are, I don't know what it is, they're at their heads in the sand, and they don't really understand that this is really happening in their country, that, what they consider to be the essence of democratic government is basically being taken over by a dictator, an autocratic government. And they don't want to believe that, but it's happening. And the rest of the world is seeing it, and a lot of people in the States are seeing it, but still a lot of Americans, MAGA supporters, just don't seem to get that. So it makes negotiating with Trump that much more difficult because he knows that there's nobody he has to answer to. He's not the smartest man. He's not a deal maker. The guy, he's a failed businessman. Just about everything he's undertaken have failed. And now he's a failed politician, too, because look what he's doing to the U.S. economy and to jobs there. But we still have to find some sort of a deal for Canada. So that's the challenge that Dominic LeBlanc and, of course, on behalf of Prime Minister Carney, are facing right now. It is a daunting task, to say the least, to think that we've got to be able to find some ground here. When you've got Ludnick saying he wants to kill the auto industry here, we got Trump still talking about Canada just becoming the 51st state. They're just not listening to what's going on, and they're not paying attention to what's going on. That's why I'm skeptical. I have every faith in Dominic LeBlanc and certainly in Prime Minister Carney and those that are trying to find some way to get a better deal for Canada. But the odds are insurmountable. Not impossible, but insurmountable. And as long as the American people understand that Trump is going to do what he wants, it's going to be problematic. Now, I don't want to leave everything on a bad, sour note like that. There is, as far as I can tell, one entity that still could have an influence on Donald Trump. Money talks. It always has with him. As a matter of fact, money talks with an awful lot of politicians these days. It's the business people. It's the owners of the steel industry, the auto industry, the other industries. They seem to be on side, or at least most of them seem to be on side with all this tariff crap that he's instituting these days. If they start to speak up, he'll listen because money does talk. And let's face it, he loves to see those donations coming in. He surrounds himself with wealthy people. Most of the people in his cabinet are all millionaires. That's why they're there. Make a huge contribution to the Trump campaign. Bingo, you become a secretary of whatever. The health secretary is basically the former head of the World Wrestling Federation, or the education secretary, rather. You've got Robert Kennedy Jr., God help us all, is in charge of health, and on it goes. But it's all based on how much money they gave him. So if the money in the United States all of a sudden goes to Trump and said, this has got to stop, there's a pretty good chance that maybe he will listen to that, and that could alter things significantly. But it hasn't happened yet, and we're waiting for it to happen. And as we continue to see some of those numbers, and I know that that's what the Prime Minister is talking about here, is the longer this goes on, the more impact it's having on the American economy. And maybe some of those folks in the ivory towers and some of these corporate offices are finally going to understand that there's got to be a change here. And as soon as they can influence Donald Trump about that, then at least we're going to be on solid ground to continue with our negotiations. We're watching very carefully with crossed fingers and hope that that's going to happen, and in parallel with a better deal for Canada and other nations too. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks as always for being with us. If you're watching on YouTube, great to have you with us. Hit that notification bell and make sure you pass the word on to others. And thank you once again to everybody for subscribing. It's great to see so many folks coming on board. These are important issues, and they're having an impact on each and every one of us. Even those that say, oh, I don't care, it doesn't have an impact on me. Yeah, it does. The price of everything in grocery stores, the price of utilities, the price of everything. So even if you don't care about politics, or don't think you care about politics, politics is impacting you. So we want to have those discussions, and we want to present facts so that we can have an educated opinion about what's happening. And your subscriptions help us to do that. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.